The dense and cold air of Black Moor seemed to carry an invisible weight. The mist crept along the ground like a living creature, enveloping the tires of the small minibus that glided along the bumpy road. Callum gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to ignore the chills that ran down his neck. Behind him, the group of tourists, initially excited, was now restless. The silence filled the space, broken only by the muffled sound of the engine and the occasional crack of trees in the darkness. "Are you sure this shortens the journey?" Fiona, a young history teacher, asked, her tone tinged with skepticism. She adjusted her glasses, trying to see beyond the fogged window. Callum laughed, a short and forced sound. "Of course it does. This road is just a legend to scare children. We'll arrive before nightfall, trust me." But it was too late. The sun, hidden behind heavy clouds, had already begun to yield to darkness. A streetlight flickered ahead, its weak and intermittent glow illuminating for seconds a disconcerting scene. Deep marks on the asphalt, as if something heavy had scraped the ground. In the distance, an indistinct shape seemed to vanish into the mist. "Did you see that?" Angus, the oldest in the group, whispered, his voice heavy with concern. Everyone looked out the window, but the empty road reflected only the echo of their own fears. The radio, which had been playing soft music until then, crackled and plunged into static. Amidst the noise, something peculiar emerged. Indistinct voices speaking in a language no one could recognize. The first shadow of mystery hung in the air. The group still didn't know it, but Black Moor was just beginning to reveal its true face. The tension inside the minibus was palpable. Callum kept his eyes fixed on the road, but the fog seemed to thicken with each passing meter, turning the journey into an endless stretch of shadows and uncertainties. The tourists shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. The sound of the radio had morphed into a cacophony of static and murmurs, as if something or someone was trying to communicate through the frequencies. "Callum, I think we should turn back," Fiona said, this time with firmness in her voice. She clutched the pendant she wore around her neck, a small crucifix that seemed to faintly glow under the flickering light. "Those marks on the road and the radio, something isn't right." Before he could respond, a metallic sound echoed loudly, as if something had scraped along the side of the vehicle. Angus was the first to turn his face, his eyes widening as he noticed something moving in the mist. It was an indistinct figure, tall and hooded, slowly walking in the opposite direction to the vehicle. But as the minibus passed it, the headlights illuminated something more disturbing. There was no face beneath the hood, only a dark void that seemed to devour the light. "My God, what was that?" Angus murmured, his voice almost a whimper. Callum swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. "Probably just a drifter, those strange people who live in isolation." But deep down, he knew that wasn't normal. The whispers on the radio intensified, and the tourists began to hear words forming in their minds, even though no recognized language was being spoken. It was an ancient, primal language, heavy with a weight that made their ears buzz and hearts race. "Look!" shouted Caitlin, a young photographer, pointing outside. Etched into the asphalt, at a point where the minibus had stopped, was a symbol. It was an irregular circle with lines cutting through its interior, pulsing with a faint red glow. The air around it felt colder. "I've seen this before," Fiona whispered, almost inaudibly. "It's a Celtic symbol of sacrifice." The group was divided between growing fear and the need to press on. But the road, alive and merciless, had already decided their fate. The sensation of suffocation inside the minibus intensified. The air felt heavier, as if each breath was filtered through something invisible. Callum gripped the steering wheel so tightly that the knuckles of his fingers turned white. He tried to accelerate, but the tires spun uselessly over the damp asphalt, as if the road had decided they shouldn't leave. This isn't normal," Angus murmured, his voice trembling. The mist. It's denser. It doesn't move with the wind. Fiona slid towards the window and began to examine the pulsating symbol etched into the ground. This isn't just a Celtic symbol, it's a summons, she said, her voice low but filled with urgency. A summons for something. Before anyone could ask what she meant, a muffled sound sliced through the silence. Footsteps, not the steps of an ordinary person, but of something larger, heavier. They echoed from all sides, reverberating on the road as if it itself were alive. Caitlin pulled out her camera, aiming it at the mist. The lens captured a movement, a shadow dragging in the background, barely visible but impossible to ignore. "There's something out there," Caitlin whispered, panic evident in her voice. "Stay calm!" Callum shouted, more to himself than to the others. He turned the key in the ignition again, futilely trying to get the vehicle to start. Suddenly, the radio sprang to life again, but not with static. Now, there were clear voices. They recited something in unison, like a sinister chorus. The language was incomprehensible, but each syllable seemed to pierce the nerves of the listeners. The lights of the minibus began to flicker, illuminating the road ahead intermittently. That was when everyone saw several hooded figures emerged from the fog, standing still like statues. Their faces concealed, revealed no expression, but their bodies pointed directly at the vehicle. "They are watching us," Caitlin stammered. Before anyone could react, the sound of something scraping the roof of the minibus echoed, slow and threatening, like claws scratching metal. Callum looked in the rearview mirror, but what he saw made him freeze. A shadow even larger was approaching down the road, as if the darkness itself was taking shape. The sound on the roof intensified, louder and closer, reverberating like sharp claws, scratching the rusted metal of the minibus. Inside, the group remained paralyzed, each facing their own fear. Callum, still at the wheel, felt his body tremble, but his mind repeated a single thought: "I need to get them out of here." He tried to start the vehicle again, but the engine coughed and died. "Come on, work, damn it!" he shouted, banging on the dashboard, while Angus, seated just behind him, whispered a prayer he could barely complete. The radio came back to life, now louder. It seemed to call out the names of the occupants, one by one, dragging the syllables like a malignant echo. "I heard my name," Fiona said, her face pale. She clutched the crucifix against her chest. "This isn't a coincidence." Outside, the hooded figures began to move. Slowly, as if a macabre choreography were unfolding, they surrounded the minibus in a perfect circle. Their footsteps made no sound, but the energy around them seemed to vibrate, growing denser and more suffocating. Caitlin, still holding her camera, pointed it at one of them and took a photo. When she looked at the display, what she saw made her blood run cold. There was nothing there, just fog. "They're not real, or are they more than real?" she whispered, unable to process it. Suddenly, the symbol etched on the road began to glow again, but now with increasing intensity. The red light spread across the ground like roots, forming a larger and more elaborate pattern that connected the figures to the minibus. The ground trembled beneath their feet. "We're inside something bigger," Fiona said, her voice hoarse. "This isn't just an accident. We were brought here." "For what?" Callum shouted, frustration and fear overflowing. Before Fiona could respond, the red light exploded in a flash, blinding them all. When their vision returned, the interior of the minibus was different. There were no more windows, only solid darkness surrounding the vehicle. The space felt larger, distorted, as if they were in another place or outside of time. A guttural laugh filled the air, echoing from all directions. It wasn't a human voice. It vibrated with an impossible depth, full of malevolence and a promise of something worse to come. "You dared to tread the path of Black Moor," the voice announced, "and now your souls are my reward." Fiona fell to her knees, murmuring prayers. Angus, on the other hand, stared into the void with wide eyes, as if he had understood something the others had not yet grasped. "This is a judgment," he said, low but clear enough to be heard. "This road is not a road. It's a portal, and we are being tested." In that instant, one of the hooded figures entered the minibus. Its movements were smooth, almost elegant, but carried a tangible threat. When it lowered its hood, the revealed face was Fiona's, or rather, a distorted version of her, with eyes black as coal and a smile that bore no human emotion. "I am the truth you avoid," the figure said, its voice a cold echo. "Here, each of you will face what you fear most deeply." The light flickered again, and the scene changed once more. Each of the tourists was separated, now in a space that reflected their worst fears. Callum was trapped on a never-ending road, driving without ever finding an exit. Caitlin was surrounded by distorted photos, each revealing something dark about herself. Fiona, in an empty field, heard the voices of the dead calling to her, while Angus was alone in a crumbling church, confronted by the echoes of his own sins. Each faced a terrible version of themselves until a single choice was presented: sacrifice something they loved or be lost forever in the darkness of Black Moor. Callum was the first to make a decision. He screamed, tearing off the necklace his deceased wife had given him, and threw it on the glowing ground. Take this, and let me go." The road responded with a roar, and Callum was thrown back into the minibus, gasping and covered in sweat. One by one, the others made their choices, each revealing the secrets and regrets that had kept them trapped. When they were all back, the hooded figures vanished, but the symbol continued to pulse like a malignant heart. The group realized that, although they had escaped the worst, Black Moor had not finished with them yet. The minibus, now enveloped in absolute silence, finally started moving. Callum, with deep-set eyes and irregular breathing, gripped the steering wheel as if his life depended on it. Behind him, the others were in shock. No one could find words to describe what they had experienced, but they all knew they had left something behind on that road, something they could never recover. "Is it over?" Fiona murmured, breaking the silence. Her gaze was fixed on the window, but all she could see was the reflection of herself, haunted. She still felt the weight of the voices whispering her name. Callum replied without taking his eyes off the road. "I think so. We're moving away." But he wasn't sure. The fog still surrounded them, thick and impenetrable, and the radio remained silent. Angus, sitting at the back, mumbled disconnected prayers, while Caitlin reviewed the photos on her camera. To her surprise, all the images from the night had vanished. It was as if Black Moor had erased any proof of their existence. "We're not free," Angus finally said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Black Moor hasn't let us go. It only gave us a choice. And now we must carry that." The group slowly realized that something had changed within them. Each felt a subtle presence, an invisible weight that hadn't been there before. Callum, looking in the rearview mirror, saw something that made his stomach turn. The hooded figures were still there in the distance, immobile but watching, and more disturbingly, the symbol on the road, which had disappeared from sight, now seemed engraved in their minds. When they finally emerged from the fog and saw the lights of a city in the distance, the relief was fleeting. The minibus stopped in a car park, and they exited without exchanging many words. But as they said their goodbyes, something strange happened. Each carried a sense of déjà vu, as if there were something unresolved, a persistent echo of the judgment they had faced. Fiona was the last to leave. Before closing the door, she looked at Callum. "We should never have come here," she said. He silently agreed, lacking the courage to say anything more. When the minibus engine finally turned off, the radio sprang back to life, emitting a single word: return. A few days after the incident, Fiona, unable to forget what she had experienced, began researching Black Moor. The event seemed more than mere hauntings. There was something deeper, a connection to a forgotten past. Sitting in her small office, surrounded by history books and ancient maps, she found an intriguing reference in a medieval manuscript. The text, dated from the 14th century, mentioned a cursed road in the highlands of Scotland. It was called An Rathad Faubhar, the Sharp Way. According to legend, the site had been used by druids for judgment rituals, where those deemed unworthy were sent to face their own souls in the form of supernatural manifestations. Few returned, and those who did were never the same. Further on, the manuscript mentioned a symbol, the same one that had appeared on the road. It was described as a portal activated only by the presence of individuals carrying deep secrets or unresolved regrets. "The path does not choose at random," one of the passages read. "It tests those who cross its borders, seeking souls to balance the scales between worlds." Fiona reread the excerpt several times, a chill running down her spine. This explained what they had faced, but it also raised a terrifying question. Why them? What had the path seen in each of them to draw them into its judgment? Meanwhile, Angus, in his isolated home, struggled against recurring nightmares. Every night, he dreamt of the symbol, pulsating in the darkness, and heard voices calling his name. Deep down, he knew that Black Moor had not finished with them. It was as if the road had left an invisible mark on their souls, a bond that could not be broken. In a small village near Black Moor, a young shepherd stumbled upon something unsettling while walking along the road. A diary. On the cover, the name Callum was inscribed. Curious, he opened the first page and read, "If you have found this, know that the road is alive, and it awaits you." The shepherd lifted his eyes, gazing at the mist that began to form in the distance. He quickly closed the diary, but the sound of whispers was already echoing in his ears. And thus, the terror of Black Moor endures, an eternal cycle of regret and judgment. The road never forgets, and for those who cross its path, the true journey only begins when the mist clears.